Hello, good evening. So I'm very honored to be able to introduce my friend Rachel Aviv, and it's also actually like an interesting challenge because um, I feel like I feel like she's someone who doesn't really want to be praised or have anything particularly distinctive about her pointed out. So it's kind of a challenge to meet that. And I thought one way to talk about this would be to share. I also. So Rachel has been writing pieces, is a staff writer for The New Yorker, and every time she writes a piece, as far as I can tell, the web like skips a heartbeat for a moment because her work is so engaging and so meaningful to many people. But I also was going to mention that I sometimes teach nonfiction writing to graduate students, and I have like this sort of arc of my semester, whereas about 3/4 of the way through the semester, I confront them with a Rachel Aviv piece, and everyone gets a bit tense and quiet, and then I make them sort of map it out, and I treat it as a kind of intense therapy where they have to see what happens when you burn away all your judgments, all your cheesy kind of Washington Post opinion piece emotions, all those things that they've been working with all semester, and they suddenly realize that if you want to write something that feels very powerful, very intense, very honest, very true, empathic, genuinely curious about other people, you have to sort of let go of so much of what the students come to the semester with. And when they leave, after having gone through a close analysis of Rachel's work and seeing how much of it involves a lot of listening and how much of it involves thinking before you put your pen to the paper. I'll still remember years ago she was kind enough to come visit one of my classes, and one of the things that students still bring back to me that she said then was that, I remember how Rachel said that she used to think that you would sort of like read a little bit and call a few people and then work like intensely on the page. And I realized that like the ratio of researching and listening to other people and thinking to the time on the page had to be shifted dramatically. And that's something that really transformed them and that I think has a lot to do with what's special about Rachel's work, which is on the one hand, something singular and that only she can report and do, and that people talk to her who wouldn't really necessarily want to talk to other people, and whereas other journalists would be left on the kind of front porch of someone's psyche, somehow, without being invasive or aggressive, Rachel Aviv again and again is sort of invited to the deepest, furthest back rooms of the house and into the attic and into the basement. So I just want to thank Rachel for her work and for the model that she offers as a way of kind of being in the world and having a genuine interest in people outside of ourselves. So thank you.
Thank you so much to Rivka, who has somewhere to go, but I really... so I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book and then skip ahead, but it's all from the prologue. In the early weeks of first grade, I made a friend named Elizabeth. She was the oldest child in our class, but tiny with thin, knobby limbs. We connected over the game Mancala, dropping marbles into a wooden board with 14 shallow holes. I avoided other classmates so I'd be ready when Elizabeth asked me to play. Somehow she always did. I felt that I had willed our friendship into being. I asked my mom why Elizabeth's house in Bloomfield Hills, a wealthy suburb of Detroit, smelled so different from ours. I was disappointed that her answer, laundry detergent, felt so ordinary. Elizabeth's house was so large that I was sure she got lost in it. She had a yellow canopy bed, a walk-in closet, a swimming pool. She showed me how when she brushed her blonde hair, it got even lighter. Her family had a refrigerator in their basement devoted just to sodas, and one day Elizabeth proposed that we feed Coke to our knees. We tried the experiment in her babysitter's car and laughed as Coke dripped onto the seats. It seemed incredible that there was only one way to drink. At home, I sometimes pretended I was Elizabeth. I walked into rooms and imagined I didn't know where they led. It seemed like a fluke, a bit of bad luck, that I had been born as me rather than as Elizabeth. I remember waking up forlorn after a dream. I was given the chance to become Elizabeth if I picked the right seat on the school bus. I walked past 13 rows, overwhelmed by the opportunity, and chose the wrong seat. I had just turned 6, and the boundaries between people felt porous. During music class, I was assigned a seat between 2 boys. On one side was Sloan, the tallest kid in first grade. He had a perennially runny nose, the snot greenish. On the other side was Brent, who was chubby and breathed so heavily that I sometimes checked to see if he'd fallen asleep. Their physical attributes seemed contagious. To protect myself, I tried to sit at the centermost point of my chair, as far away as possible from both boys. If I moved toward Sloan, I felt I'd grow too tall. If I inched toward Brent, I'd become fat. My older sister, Sari, and I had watched a news segment about an obese man who had a heart attack in bed and then had to be removed from his apartment by a crane. We tried to imagine the logistics. Did they have to knock down the walls? How did they attach the man to the machine? I decided to err on the side of Sloan. At lunch, everyone in my class was required to take at least a mouse taste of each dish. 1 noodle, a single pea. Many years later, my first grade teacher, Miss Kelfin, told me, "You just sit there looking at your mouse taste pensively." And I'd be like, "Go ahead, we only have 20 minutes, keep going." But it was a slow roll. 2 weeks into the school year, I asked for permission to visit the bathroom after lunch. "Do you have to go potty?" Miss Kelfin asked. She said that I told her that I just wanted to look in the mirror. A few days later, I wouldn't touch the mouse taste that Miss Kelfin had put on my plate. She asked if instead I'd be going to the salad bar, where I sometimes got croutons. I tried to hide my grin when I said no. She looked at me carefully and made an expression that I didn't know how to classify. It looked like a frown and a smile at the same time. I could feel her contemplating who I was, and her focus was exhilarating. I loved her and worried that my feelings were unreciprocated. It seemed to me that she preferred the stolid children whose mothers volunteered at school. For the next 2 days, I mostly refused to eat or drink. I don't remember my reasoning, only the reactions of the adults and my vague sense of pride. I got the idea from Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which we'd celebrated the week before. It was the first time I realized that it was possible to say no to food. The decision retained the religious energy from the holiday and carried an aura of martyrdom. I went to Hebrew school 3 times a week and liked to entertain the idea that I had some invisible channels of communication with God. Several times a day, I prayed for my family to be healthy until we were 87 years or older, repeating "me and mom" several times because our survival felt more important. I remember walking on the pebbles in my dad's girlfriend's backyard and realizing that every step had been preordained by God. But the epiphany was eclipsed by self-consciousness. I felt that maybe I was having my burning bush moment. The content of the revelation was secondary to my desire to distinguish myself as someone capable of having one. On September 30th, 1988, I told my mom that I was so dizzy I felt I would bump into a wall. I had barely eaten for 3 days. She took me to the pediatrician. I was thinking, well, they'll give you some fluids, and then I'll take you home, my mom later told me. She described me as an exuberant and silly 6-year-old, but my dad's girlfriend, Linda, who became my stepmom, recalled that in her presence I was the saddest child she had ever known. When presented with activities that she assumed would excite me, I often replied with the same phrase, "What's so big about that?" Linda observed that I had an unusual ability to sit completely still while silently crying, often at the kitchen table. My dad would tell me to eat and I would refuse, sometimes for more than an hour, until he gave up and drove me to school. My doctor noted that I had lost 4 pounds in the last month. Until recently, I'd had a normal diet, he wrote, consisting mostly of pizza, chicken, cereal. He described my current accomplishments as running, jumping, riding two-wheeler. For personal social, he noted that I was bored. He advised my mom to take me to Children's Hospital of Michigan in Detroit, where I was admitted for failure to eat. A psychiatrist there described me as a well-developed but very thin female in no acute distress. After interviewing my mother and father, who had divorced a year earlier and were still fighting over custody, one doctor at the hospital wrote, "Her mother states that her father pokes fun at obese individuals, and the father did not protest the statement." My father, on the other hand, proposed that my problem originated with my mother, who was overly concerned with foods. She did stockpile so many whole grain breads that when we opened the freezer door, loaves bought at farmers markets around Detroit would sometimes topple out. But she had a relatively normal, if passionate, relationship with food. Like many women her age, she occasionally tried to diet with flagging conviction. The week before my hospitalization, my mom kept a journal for me. I couldn't write yet, so she transcribed as I talked, but I shared no details about my state of mind, only chronological accounts of my day interspersed with questions like, where does a snake's diarrhea come out of, and why don't people have tails? My mom, who had recently broken up with her boyfriend, kept her own journal too. That week, she recorded a dream. She was always documenting her dreams, in which she asked a gardener to take apart her house brick by brick. All that remains is dirt and the cement shape of the house, she wrote. On my first evening at the hospital, a nurse presented me with a tray of food, which I refused. My mom was hungry, so she ate it instead. They got very mad at me, she told me. I was not to confuse what I ate with what you ate. The next day, the nurses gave me an IV because I'd become dehydrated. My medical records do not present a coherent picture of why I wasn't eating or drinking. One psychologist wrote, "Clearly her symptoms are an expression of the pathology in the relationship between her mother and father." Another observed, "Rachel attempts to look inside herself to understand and resolve her intense feelings related to her external world, but struggles with a overcomplicated thought process, leading to a self-condemning attitude, i.e., I must be the problem." Although the description could apply to almost anyone, the doctors concluded that I had an unusual case of anorexia nervosa. Anorexia has often been described as a reading disorder, brought on by uncritical consumption of texts that present thinness as the feminine ideal. I was only starting to learn to read. I had never heard of anorexia. When my mom told me the diagnosis, it sounded to me like a species of dinosaur. The Japanese scholar Takayo Makai, a former anorexic, describes a similar sense of disorientation when encountering the word in the 1980s, before anorexia was well known in Japan. The 8-letter word was just an empty envelope, unstamped and unaddressed. My father and Linda went to our local library and read the only book they could find on the subject, The Golden Cage by Hilda Brooke, published in 1978. Brooke, a psychoanalyst known as Lady Anorexia, began writing about anorexia in the 60s when the illness was obscure. She hypothesized that novelty was essential to the disease, which she described as a blind search for a sense of identity and selfhood. She predicted, inaccurately, that once a critical mass of girls became anorexic, the incidence of the illness might decrease because it would no longer feel special. The illness used to be the accomplishment of an isolated girl who felt she had found her own way to salvation, she wrote. Each one was, in a way, an original inventor of this misguided road to independence. My mom also read about the illness, mostly from the psychoanalytic perspective that was dominant at the time, and internalized a common message. The mother was to blame. "It's I who caused all the pain and the original injury," she wrote in a spiral-bound journal that she often carried in her purse. She turned this realization into an indictment of her own character. "I must own that I have a propensity to be mean and to hurt," she wrote. "What I do sometimes to my children is mean, though I think I try very hard to protect them." Neither my sister nor I remember her doing anything approaching mean, but she believed what these books told her about herself. In notes for a conversation with my doctor, she reminded herself to be humble and not to claim to understand what's happening. The word anorexia felt so powerful that I was afraid to say it. I was learning to sound out letters, and words felt like tangible entities that somehow embodied their meaning. I would not say the names of any foods because pronouncing the words felt like the equivalent of eating. If such terms were used in her presence, a psychologist wrote, she would cover her ears. I wouldn't say 8 because the number sounded like 8, A-T-E. I was upset when one of the nurses, frustrated by my stubbornness, told me I was a tough cookie. My mother was more sensitive to my concerns, and when I asked her about the condition of my hospital roommate, a girl with diabetes, my mom avoided the word sugar. She explained, "It's like the opposite of what you have." I was assigned a young psychologist, Thomas Koepke, who was soft-spoken and nurturing. I answered his questions with as few words as possible. I had a vague fear that even if when I stayed silent, my thoughts were being transcribed and printed from the back of my head, like pages released from a printer. In an evaluation that today makes me self-conscious about the career I have chosen, another psychologist wrote, "Rachel handled herself in a way that she appeared to very consciously be aware of her ability to control the interview." I'm just going to move ahead a little bit to sort of bringing this personal experience into the larger statement of like what the book is doing. A few years ago, I went to Sweden to report a story about a condition known as resignation syndrome. Hundreds of children from former Soviet and Yugoslav states who had been denied asylum in Sweden had taken to their beds. They refused food. They stopped talking. Eventually, they seemed to lose the ability to move. Many had to be given feeding tubes. Some gradually slipped into states resembling comas. One child told me that during his months in bed, he'd felt as if he were in a glass box with fragile walls deep in the ocean. If he spoke or moved, it would create a vibration, which would cause the glass to shatter. The water would pour in and kill me, he said. Psychiatrists proposed that the condition was a reaction to both the stress of the migration proceedings and the trauma in the countries the children's families had fled. But they couldn't understand why the illness occurred only in Sweden, not in any neighboring Nordic countries, where refugees from the same countries had resettled. As I interviewed families, I discovered that many of the children diagnosed with resignation syndrome had known someone who suffered from the disorder too. There were allegations in the Swedish press that the children were malingering, especially after Sweden established resignation syndrome as grounds for granting residency. But when I met the children, I felt sure they were not pretending. They took weeks, sometimes months, to emerge from a nearly catatonic state, even after their families were told they could stay in Sweden. What began as a protest seemed to take on its own momentum. The children had become martyr figures, a role that at first seemed freeing, but it began to destroy them. My conversations with families and doctors in Sweden made me reconsider my early experience with anorexia. Something about the mute, fasting children in Sweden felt familiar to me. For a child, solipsistic by nature, there are limits to the way that despair can be communicated. Culture shapes the scripts that expressions of distress will follow. In both anorexia and resignation syndrome, children embody anger and a sense of powerlessness by refusing food, one of the few methods of protest available to them. Experts tell these children that they are behaving in a recognizable way that has a label. The children then make adjustments, conscious and unconscious, to the way they've been classified. Over time, a willed pattern of behavior becomes increasingly involuntary and ingrained. The philosopher Ian Hacking uses the term looping effect to describe the way that people get caught in self-fulfilling stories about illness. A new diagnosis can change the space of possibilities for personhood, he writes. We make ourselves in our own scientific image of the kinds of people it is possible to be. In an essay about the children diagnosed with resignation syndrome in Sweden, Hacking refers to Pascal's wager. To avoid the possibility of eternal hell, we should behave as if God is real, even though we lack proof of his existence. Over time, we may internalize the faith we've been simulating. Our belief will become sincere. Hacking proposes that for some illnesses, a similar process is at work. We find a way to express our distress through imitation until eventually we have learned, or better, acquired a new psychic state. I think I maybe should have read the part where I was modeling myself after all the older girls on the anorexic unit. It might have made a little bit more sense, but I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Camille Rankin. I'm going to be introducing Hafizah Jeter tonight. If you've read her book, I am the Camille that's in the book. So I'm in the first chapter, so hi. And I'm going to read my introduction. I'm not good at off the cuff, so I'm going to read this. Over the years, Hafizah and I have often discussed what it means to be black in this country. Lately, I found myself ruminating on a theory I have about being Black and American. I believe that the experience of Blackness in this country holds within it a natural affinity for complexity, the ability to hold several seemingly contradictory truths in your mind at the same time, several realities layered over each other. A double consciousness that extends beyond one's conception of oneself to one's conception of the entire world around them. A man can love his children and be generous with his neighbors, but he can still hate me for being Black. He can hate my parents, hate my brother, hate my child. A country can give me so much and take so much from me at the same time. It can be a beacon of opportunity and an opportunistic villain, the land of the free, and the land that holds a record number of its inhabitants behind bars. America, by which I mean the United States of, isn't a culture that welcomes this kind of complexity. It's a country with one story about itself, one heroic tale that is told and retold, a story that America believes you must accept in order to be truly American. In her captivating memoir, as she re-examines her own story, Hafizah Jeter also tells a different story about America, a different story about Blackness, about ourselves, about the place we live, about how we might care for one another. A truth I've been seeking, one I've been piecing together and reciting to myself over and over, whispering into my own ear over the din of America's exquisite and impermeable mythos. Audre Lorde calls on us to give a name to the nameless so it can be thought. Jeter names this nameless truth the Black period. What would it look like to emerge from erasure? The Black period swirls around this question, and in the question itself is a hopefulness, a possibility of reclamation. As Jeter rewrites the meaning of her own body, Black, queer, disabled, the child of Muslim Nigerian woman and a Southern Baptist man, the Black period strips back America's palimpsest, redrawing the truth of what it means to be Black and human, digging through the strata we've been told holds our origin and into something deeper. This book casts our sight in all directions, asking us to reinterpret what we see. The view is at once brutal and buoyant, holding in our sight that truth I know we know, that neither we nor our nation be only one thing. That, in the words of Susan Sontag, words that have been Hafizah's email signature for as long as I've known her, more is possible than people are telling you. I came to history because I was hurting. I came desperate, wanting to comprehend. I arrived at these words toward the end of the Black period and found that Jeter had named a hurt I'd always known was there, a hurt that seeks its origin, and in so doing, bores into the most tender places, unearthing both unspeakable horrors and lost artifacts of unspeakable beauty. The Black period, in its unearthing, is barb and balm. In its pages lies a place where I can take apart the pieces of our world and rebuild it and myself, whole. A place where Black means the richest, most fertile soil. In Jeter's decadent, elegantly crafted prose, lyrical and playful in turn, is a reminder that there is joy and abundance even in the midst of the most troubled waters, and that the work of healing can be difficult as well as beautiful. There are moments of this book that left a mark in me so deep I will never recover, for how Jeter has shown me where we live, held my gaze where the truth was too bright to see. I will carry those marks with me into the world and carry the light of those truths alongside them. I'm so grateful for the work that Hafizah Jeter has done in the Black period and for the mind she shares with us in its pages. Please welcome her.
I wasn't nervous till that. I was just like upstaged by your introduction, but I should have known. That's why I had her do it. She's like, so in the book there are like images that are throughout, and so I just threw some in a PowerPoint so y'all could have the immersive experience. My father is a painter and artist, and all the images in the book are by him, including the cover. So, since it's the end of the year, I'm going to read the last chapter. There are no spoilers, really. The only thing I think to know, two things, like that quote that Camille read, like what would it look like to emerge from erasure? That's not my, the book swirls around that, but that is from my friend Parl Sagel, who's also a writer at The New Yorker, and the book kind of tries to like look at that question. And so I'm going to read the last chapter for the epilogue, and really the thing to know is it takes place that it's a road trip that my sister took with my mother like shortly before my mother died, like 20 years ago. And the last chapter is the title chapter, The Black Period. Every time I thought I'd found a beginning, I ended up having to take another step further back. The earth was without form, void. There was darkness upon the face of the deep. Geologists call these opening verses of time in the book of Genesis the Precambrian supereon. The first and only, it accounts for 7/8 of the Earth's 4-billion-year history. It was a world that, like an elementary school science project, bubbled with sulfur. No flowers to be found anywhere on Earth. The only building blocks for a brand new God were the dust and gas orbiting the sun. No Adam's rib yet to sculpt from. Just oceans of liquid rock and volcanoes erupting beneath asteroid skies. It was a Hades-like world. It was a world, the spitting image of a warning, like the priests of my school day sermoning on about how easily hell found the faithless. In the Precambrian, geologists suspect the moon was born. It took another billion years for the world to cool, for the volcano's eruptions to make the islands that eventually collided into the continents we know. Epochs passed, the world of then still unrecognizable, a foreigner painted in black basalt, yellow dust to see. Then one day, in the days before the idea of days was formed, webs of green pulled themselves up from the light-drenched waters. The grass between our toes was still millions of years away. The inland of our future world still bare and rocky, but ferns and mosses had begun to curtain the shores. Still no flowers, only the gods of nature slowly architecting palaces of green. Then the 180 million year Mesozoic era arrived. It held inside its mouth like a pearl, the Jurassic period of Steven Spielberg movies, the first fishes, turtles, and flying dinosaurs. But it was still barren of the hot orange marigolds my mother grew every summer. This was the Pangea world, and it was waiting for the 79 million year crustacean period, which, aided by the birth of bees, bore the age of flowers. In an instant, the whole world changed. Was it exactly like this, when Jamila fielded what, from our mother, was a simultaneously surprising and unsurprising request? Drive me to New Jersey. How did we not know this was our own Big Bang? Did our mother whisper the question, or did she declare? In her secrecy, our mother was a woman who kept us guessing. She never missed an episode of Oprah, loved herself some McDonald's apple pie, and laughed out loud when she read my school copy of Candide. There are so many things about her I still can't tell if I've forgotten or if I've simply never known. In a March 1993 article in the Akron Beacon Journal, a reporter once wrote, Jeter is active in teaching African culture and helping Native Africans adjust to the Akron area. This is my Grammy, Jeter said, smiling. She had been asked about the President's Award she received from the Ohio Black Women's Leadership Caucus for her above and beyond distinguished service to the Black community. I was 9, and she'd been an African in America for 6 years. She kept the bronze-plated award in her bedroom closet with her green card and everything else she held precious, and where now my father keeps her organ donor medal. But who were these Africans she helped ease into America, and why don't I remember them? Do they know she's gone? Drive me to New Jersey, our mother asks her oldest child. When Jamila departs South Carolina for New Jersey with our mother, it's still early enough in fall to accidentally call it summer. Whenever I picture the two of them, it always feels like a chase. Over and over, I've imagined them speeding down the highway with the windows of my sister's silver sedan rolled down, the breeze flowing through our mother's close-cropped afro, flowers sprinting with them up the highway, and our mother racing south to north, not for freedom, but for goodbye. This time, she's both Bonnie and Clyde. She's trying to filch more time from an almost emptied hourglass. Had she, like her own father, had a premonition of her own death? Did she feel Alhamis, her father's warning of that final Thursday coming? My cousin Mimi, Auntie Maro's youngest child, lived in New Jersey with her husband Hassan and their 3 daughters. Like she had with me and Jamila, our mother had carried Mimi and every one of Mimi's daughters, cloth wrapped on her back. Was it that our mother wanted to speak her native language one last time to someone she loved and in person? With Nigeria so far away, with our mother trying to outrun her own fading light, was Mimi as close to home as she could get, or was Mimi the only home she could stomach the heart to see? If our mother knew she was going to die, I wonder, why didn't she race towards me? When flowers first appeared, like you and me, like everything on this earth, they came by stardust. The same stars that today still repair our bodies' daily decays. Flowers and us, both celestial remnants, our bodies as old as the universe. The stars, like rocks, like history, laugh at the idea of a single year, which is to say, we are intended to be made of memory. In the beginning of the world, you should know, flowers pollinated themselves through geological time and evolutionary study, like enslaved Africans transforming into Black people. Flowers taught themselves to code switch into never-traversed territories, into the language of bees and birds. Strangers in a strange land, for survival, they integrated, assimilated, until the beauty of the foreign world they found themselves in resembled their own image. As anthropologist Lauren Isley says, flowers got into strange environments. Isley describes the age of flowers as a soundless explosion, like what, as a child, I'd imagine Beethoven felt when he made music, a beauty without definition. To make this explosion palpable for human consumption, geological clock analogies can compress the world down to a year, a day, a single hour. In the 60-minute version of the Earth, the explosion of flowers, which in reality lasted millions of years, exists for only the last 90 seconds. Humans appear with just a single second left. The birth of a nation doesn't even make the clock. When my sister's second son, Nuha, was born, save his father's eyes, he looked like no one else, like he'd arrived on Earth from an unplaceable moment in history. A Black boy living in a pre-COVID Beijing, he was a night-skinned anomaly to the people who lived there and who were constantly, and without permission, trying to take his picture, until, by 3 years old, he developed a temper. From English to Mandarin to his father's Wolof to his Arabic lessons, there was so much language came slow to him. Now, trapped in my father's house in South Carolina, the 6 of them out waiting a pandemic, surrounded by Black faces, Nuha, 5 years old, has found his way to more and more speech, and every day becomes a little more legible. Here, in this legibility, his temper has transformed, and he's a child who makes jokes and laughs all the time. In his joy, this little Muslim, Gambian, Nigerian American child, who has always had a face that seemed all his own, suddenly began looking exactly like my mother. How startling, and too, hallelujah, to see a ghost. It took me months to tell either Jamila or our father that the woman we wanted back had appeared. Was I sure? There was something to Nuha's smile, the way my mother's dimples raced up his cheekbones as he, still stubborn, tried to hold his ground and disguise his happiness. The progeny of her progeny, Nuha wore her shy eyes and buttoned chin, her dark skin so smooth it always read to me like celebration. When I finally told my father and Jamila over video chat, I watched them call Nuha over. Their eyes grew big with the woman we loved arriving so suddenly on Nuha's face and for them to see. Between us, there was this new sound, this new laughter. Our history had found us, and what a relief. What would it look like to emerge from erasure? Would it look like this? Does it look like her? Flowers appeared, and they grew a seed at their heart. The seed they held there was fully embryonic and nutrient-packed. Like Black people, flowers were revolutionaries. They left a mark on and changed whatever and whoever crossed their paths. The nectar and pollen beckoned insects. Flowers lassoed themselves around hummingbirds. Like lovers, flowers and hummingbirds evolved together, and with no one able to say who fell first. As flowers spread, they became the building blocks for what powered evolution: insects, lizards, mammals. Flowers arrived, and, like Black people, immediately they sustained the whole world. In the age of flowers, even grass was rare. And then, slowly, grasses began spreading and establishing themselves as ground cover. For survival, flowers, like Black folks, developed their own double consciousness, that two-ness, two thoughts, two souls, that sense, as W.E. Du Bois writes, of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. Flowers lived as prey while also being universal building blocks for everything we know. In their double consciousness, seeds were known to hide in animals' fur, ride bees' bellies. They buried themselves whole in the intestines of birds and waited to be passed, undigested, miles away. Can you keep track of them now? My sister and our mother snaking I-95. The radio is on. What are they listening to? What is our mother thinking? I want to know what it must have been like for a mother to know this was her final goodbye. But no matter how many questions I fling at my sister, like needles looking for a little blood, Jamila can tell me almost nothing of this lottery-like moment she spent with our origin story, as our origin was coming to an end. The asphalt road ahead of them is smooth, and my fearless sister loves to talk and loves to drive, almost as much as she loves a last-minute reason to leave town. Leaf peeping season has just begun. Did the trees stand like soldiers who, with our mother's blessing, had put their armor down? The chlorophyll cells that saturate leaves with green had just started the work of draining towards fall's yellows, oranges, reds. Our mother, the sequoia of our universe, was on her last bloom. My father would be there to catch the last leaf of her as it fell, but in the slow trod she recognized as her own dying, all the leaves fell from her privately and alone. Our mother could keep any and every kind of secret, even the companion she'd been making of her own death. She stares out the windshield to where the trees lining their journey come together at the horizon like a kiss. What would our mother think of my queerness now? We were both products of our colonizers, and there's a chance I'd have had to lead her back to the Black period, where she could love me again. There were years I went back and forth between scenes of love and rejection until, like with Kwanzaa, I had to write a story that would let me be whole. A wound in the root system I'd eventually learn, though it might scar, could be healed. I could leave the jackal in my rear view. As a child, the adults that raised me modeled a world where justice was so obviously the work. It was when the Black and African adults around me were scheming, planning, shit-talking, and preparing for the daily revolutions they waged that they seemed to laugh and sing the most. There was the sweat of the fight that dripped from them, but too, there was that from the feet exhale, the deep breath finally come from doing the work together. There were times it was hard to tell the difference in their voices between strategizing and having a good time. I can't name the day, the year, the tipping point, but one day I woke up inside myself with the Black period feeling almost completely gone. I wanted to emerge from erasure, but only between God and Allah could I understand the amount of shame I'd been carrying, could be named or understood. When I was small, the seed of white America planted itself inside the fertile soil of me, and everywhere its poison ivy grew. I hadn't known to keep a measure of forgiveness for myself. I hadn't known it was possible to shake the fear of one's own reflection, or what to do with anxieties that made me feel like a movable stone, and what would happen to me if I held my shames up to light. I don't need to know what happened when Jamila and our mother got to New Jersey. Even if I did, my sister can't remember enough to tell me. Instead, I want to remember Jamila in the driver's seat of our mother's life, as she unknowingly helps the woman who made us chase the last bit of her own daylight. Not wanting to imagine our mother scared, I think of Jamila's smiling chatter, riding next to all that joyous quiet they also must have sat in. I hold on to other things, our mother's scarves, her green card, an empty bottle of her Jeter perfume that moves with me to every home where I've tried to make sense of what she would have considered an extravagant buy. Where and who was she when she made the purchase? Christian Dior's Jeter is bookended with amaranth, musk, and blackberry bass notes, and a top note of fresh mandarin. At its heart are jasmine, plum, orchid, and rose. Depending on the time of day or the day itself, jasmine flowers can have a nutty or banana-like scent. There are days or hours it can smell like mango or peach. A full day's harvest yields 6 million jasmine flowers, but just one bottle of Jeter perfume. Climate change is making flowers less fragrant as, all over the world, temperatures rise. It's incredible to think of how something so new, us, could bring the end to something as old and necessary as flowers. 17 years later, and our mother's empty bottle sits on my bookshelf, still holding her special occasion scent. When book critic Parul Sehgal asks, what would it look like to emerge from erasure? What is the verb the answer demands? Is it Toni Morrison's work of remembering, which Morrison describes as the sweat of reconstituting and recollecting a usable past? Where had the version of the world where I could love myself or be loved and begun? Where had it ended? And where had it turned to convince Black people to leave behind Black people like me? To emerge from erasure, I had to write myself back in. Why rise from the ashes without asking why I had to burn? In the beginning. In one version, in a long ago time so millions of years younger than the Grand Canyon, Aristotle from his pulpit built a philosophy on top of a foundation where slavery was written as both a destiny and a right, and Africans, the burnt-faced peoples of the world. Once upon a history, white people palimpsested their bodies onto gods. They built a Hades on top of a ready-made world, built ships, turned into hostages we whose souls refuse notions of property. Or, once upon a history, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He sailed and sailed and sailed and sailed, sailed the waters red. Indigenous blood flowed from land to river. African and Black blood flowed from ocean to land. So much blood it made a shadow so big that, only if you were searching for it, could you see the Black period inside all of that America. So often, history, like heartbreak, feels like a rope tethering the ends of a timeline. I think of the last time I held my youngest nephew, Ibrahima Alian, only 3 months old, and he felt so familiar in my arms. I see Zaid, Nuha, and my brother-in-law preparing for salad in the bedroom once reserved for my visits. Nuha, still strong-willed and easily led to distraction, oscillates between play and litany. When Zaid was smaller, 5 or 6, he drew his prayer over Jamila's like a boy practicing his letters on tracing paper. His prayer more a practice of reverence than reverence itself. Now, almost 10, he wears the face of someone who's achieved it. My nephew, a believer. Though they'll never meet, Zaid recites the takbir with his grandmother's focus. How beautiful it will be. It is impossible not to think when Nuha and Ibrahima's faces also come to this. In the beginning of myth, our mother gave us a book. There we learned we came from ascension. We came from Black folks who, remembering Africa and freedom, sung themselves into flight. In Virginia Hamilton's The People Could Fly, it was memory and rememory that melodied you free. This was before, for Black folks, there was any such thing as North. Ascension not leading to Dayton, New York, or Chicago, not leading to heaven, but leading to Africa, leading home. Everywhere our mother looked, including inside her children, was an adopted country, assimilation spreading its tentacles until, with our ancestral language no longer in common, the best she could do was remind us that whatever we were, American, Nigerian, African, no origin story had ever been written by plantation. To my father, an origin story always began with woman. With my great-grandma, Lizzie, nourishing 13 children, and then her children's children from her Georgia garden, as if she were some kind of Jesus, with his 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, feeding the 5,000. She, the only kind of Jesus my father could believe in. Our origin story was with my grandmother, Gussie May, raising a whole family under the weight of a 4th-grade education and the economic inadequacies of domestic work. An origin story began with the first step leaping into a run from Alabama to Ohio, and that southern leap back. Were always more about what we do for each other, the care, than they were about place. They were Black origin stories washed by the sun, about who stayed, who came with, and who sent money home. Origin stories where, at every turn, someone was singing. Why do we remember some things, and why do we work to forget others? Calendula, the other name for marigolds, is derived from the Latin word calende, meaning small clock or small calendar. The flower our mother loved to tend the best was time. In India, marigolds are an offering hung everywhere: temples, weddings, funerals, festivals, hotels, restaurants, and windshields. The bright orange marigolds that our mother loved represent courage and sacrifice. Marigolds also serve as a way to remember the 1.3 million Indian soldiers that fought in World War I in service to the British, and the more than 74,000 who lost their lives. All that death in the service to an empire that had left 60 million of their Indian subjects to die over the course of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The weapon was genocide by famine. Empire being empire, marigolds being marigolds, I think of India and our mother's Nigeria and all the violent ways they must have had British rule in common. Our mother's marigolds, my insistent reminder that there is this kind of kin all over the world. On the occasions my dreams are feeling kind, I dream of our mother planting orange marigolds in our garden, her body tending these small clocks. No matter the neighborhood we live in, our mother conjures flowers. Like her grandson Nuha, she wears the frown that I know underneath is actually a smile. She wears a big hat beneath the sun and wipes sweat from her forehead with the wrist of her garden glove. She sits on an upside-down plastic bucket and leans into her work. I know that leaning over like this will lay her up in bed with back hurt, but for now, she is happy to have her hands in the earth. Black folks we be the whole verb of the world. On my Brooklyn runs from one park to another, through my headphones, Public Enemy asks, how you sell soul to a soulless people who sold their souls. Banned from our damn so-called country, the song begins. By the second verse, Chuck D is spitting in the wind till it knocks a tree down in the woods, which has always been the work. Then a chorus of voices declare, Allahu Akbar, behind D's translation, God is good. Is Allahu Akbar what our mother was thinking as she and Jamila drove away, their hands tossing a goodbye out the car window while Mimi and her family looked happily on? So many years have passed now, Jamila can't even remember how long they stayed. How quick a trip could a last goodbye be? As they left, hugging my cousin, our mother did something I'd never in our briefly shared lifetime get to see. She cried. The first time Jamila told me this, it was immediately after the funeral. I was just setting into a decade of being scared all the time. She started to say the words as though an afterthought. In that way, she still loves to drop heart-sized bombs. It was only as the words came out that my sister, in her grieving dress, recognized that the tears of her never-cry Fulani woman were a warning flare. Question, what was the light like as they drove back to South Carolina? Our mother knew, like it or not, she was soon to be buried there. Question, what are the flowers that line the highway as the car pulled back across that southern border? Behind them, the sun not yet set, but wanting to. Despite all the white spaces I've populated and the ghosts of the ones still populating me, I'm always shocked to be reminded that Black folks are barely 13% of the population, of the US population. How can this be? I see us everywhere. Our minds, our bodies, our science and invention, our literature and our love songs preserve the stories white America is constantly trying to erase. Time seems to get shorter and shorter in white America. In this modern world, they won't even save their children, not from gun violence, not from floods, virus, nor a president. Before the first colonizer, before the first kidnapped person that looked like me, when this land known as the United States was referred to by many of its indigenous inhabitants as Turtle Island, capitalism was nowhere in sight, and still a whole world. There were the Havasubaja people being birthed from the floor of the Grand Canyon. They lived, they fought, they loved, they sowed. It was a world before it was ravaged, like people, by our shared colonizers. The world before cash crops turned the land gray. The earth free and belonging wholly to itself. Sunlight rushing in. Nothing had yet to be extracted. Here, the soil was so rich, so clean, it was black. It was the black period. Look, there, my sister is pulling into our parents' drive. Done playing chicken with fate, her body is stiff from a goodbye made on the run. Our mother is all the way back now, in this temporary home death will make permanent. If my mother knew I'd be all right, did she know how long it would take for me to get there? This is what it looked like to emerge from erasure. At Kwanzaa, during those years, the world seemed too white and me too queer for me to love myself. There was always light snatching me towards an opening that existed on the other side of America's tunnels. It was a reminder that in the rooms we shared as Black people, there was always an ancestor who would double back for us. Sing a song full of faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new days begun, let us march on until victory is won. At the end of every Kwanzaa celebration, from child to adult, we clasped hands and together sang the Black national anthem, Lift Every Voice. From elementary to high school, every day as students, we rose to recite a pledge of allegiance in unison. It was a pledge of fealty to a nation that does very little to take care of those who live in its country. But in those Kwanzaa rooms, what was national could also be Black. In Lift Every Voice, we sang a melody of repair, reclamation, and revision. It was a song I loved so much that, shy and scared and embarrassed as I was, I sang it despite having no sense of tune. It was a song that, even if you weren't ready for it, tugged you towards your own liberation, a song of want, the work of rememory, a song where suddenly history was the most manageable thing we'd ever carried. History was a harmony that made our hips swing in the same direction. And that is it. That's the feeling I've been trying to get back to my whole adult life. The way the first note of Lift Every Voice quivers inside me, like a memory I didn't realize was lost. The memory arriving wet with the sweat of trying to find me. That place where I could live inside what was true, that blackest form of attention. We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We sung at Kwanzaa, from child to ancestors, both the dead and living, that populated those rooms. Our tears carried pain and joys unspeakable. They watered the nation that our bodies and wombs had tilled for centuries. And like Lauren Isley said, the flowers bloomed and bloomed and bloomed. Do you understand what I mean when I say I've sat on the laps of my ancestors? I was brought up in a nation that left me knocking on the outside of its door. My ancestors are the people who raised me and the people who raised them. Their bodies came in all shapes, sizes, and makings. With their tired or ailing or disabled and loved bodies, aunties and uncles, mothers and fathers and man friends sang the Black national anthem with swagger, their lips pursed, dimples showing a knowing look. Even our mother who, like me, couldn't really dance, moved her hips. Adults shimmied their shoulders and leaned into the unbreakable circle, which only together our bodies could make. They leaned in until they were almost half bent over. They leaned in like gospel singers who had crossed over to R&B. Their whole bodies let us know, yes, Lord, the lift was coming, but ooh, baby, the black period was already here. Thank you. Camille, do you have any questions?
I can ask one. So, Rivka talked about the idea that you spend a lot more time thinking and reading and listening, the ratio of how much time you spend on the blank page or with the revision of the pages that you've accumulated. And this question is about that ratio and also how you want the relationship of your research to be with your readers. How does research move through the process of writing and then the experience that your readers would like to, you want your readers to have of that?
Sure.
Both of you, by the way, Rachel and Hafizah.
I think Rivka missed one stage of the process, which is the most frustrating stage, which is like coming up with the idea in the first place. So that to me is like, there's a huge amount of my year is just spent like trying to figure out what to write about. But then once I know what I'm writing about and I'm researching it, I do try to like pretty early on have a sense of what the structure of the story will be, because if I know the structure, it kind of guides my research in a way. And then when I'm writing, I'm just aware of never wanting to give a reader like contextual information until the moment like when the reader wants it. So I try to kind of like think about when in the story is the moment when the reader is like, wait, like that you've just piqued my interest in the context, and now is when I kind of need to understand that, but I don't want to give it to them too early or before that moment of curiosity, because then it feels like it's sort of like a commercial break to learn something. And I think like when I read, I don't like that experience of like taking a time out to learn. I want it to feel like really integral to the like story.
Yeah, I feel like it's always one of those perpetual like balances. My book, there's like an enormous amount of like research that went into it, and I included like about like 300 of the sources that I used. But I think that one of the things, especially when you're marginalized or just like the world can seem like mythically confusing, right? Like everything's happening, but actually there's a lot of sense behind what is happening if you look at the structures, right? And especially like as a Black person, that like the world, like I experienced the world like this by design, like women experience the world like this by design. And so like trying to see like who are the designers and what is the design of that, in order to try to bring like clarity to like our lived experience. Because when you have a language, you can like you can move through your life with like some type of agency. And so it was, you know, really, so for me, like the book, it always started out like intensively researched, and then in terms of like how it got woven in there, like for me, it really just is like my readers, like my agent Aisha, who's in the audience, is just like, this is too much, and like really just like fighting to like just like make it work, because so much of it just like, okay, I need to stop teaching it back to myself and really include it, and to make it seamless. But also one of the things I think that like that I'm thinking about in the work is, you know, a lot of the stuff I'm reading is like theory. It's just like so just chewy and dense, but like this theory has been written about all of us, right? And so I'm always thinking about like, how can my job as a writer, can I translate that information back to the people whose lives it's about? And like, how can I make us see like how we are experiencing it? Because we like, you know, I think one of the things I've always said about this memoir of why I did it this way is because like no one lives in memoir alone, right? You know, you go on social media and just like we all know what's happening with Twitter, and just like we're all inundated with that type of interwovenness, and so I wanted to create something that was like kind of like authentic to our life, and that requires a lot of information. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Why did you guys choose the chapters that you chose to read today?
I guess I just thought the beginning. I just read the beginning because I remember I am a really bad listener of readings. Like for me, I can't actually like take in reading auditorial. I just feel bad for you guys having to listen to me read. So I was like, how did I start it and what am I doing to like, I just picked the beginning. In hindsight, if I were to do this again, I realized like I hadn't quite selected it right, but that's why I chose mine.
And I think I kind of chose mine for the same reason of just like, I've read like the prologue every reading before, and so I was just like, let's read about flowers. Everyone's had a hard year, and it was also the shortest chapter, and like a lot of the chapters are are weaving lots of layers together, and so I also wanted to she's saying make it easy. Also as a poet, I also agree readings are terrible and hard. I feel like you might be the better answer for this because I literally just like give it to other people to read and then they tell me.
I mean, I think maybe it's a little similar to what I said before, where it's like I never want to give more than what will like sate a reader's curiosity, kind of. And so if I find myself, I feel like the narrative acts as like a limiting principle. And so if I'm giving information that doesn't like advance that sense of narrative momentum, I'll try to like cut it down. There was something else I was going to say, but it's kind of, as you were speaking, I thought of it, but it's gone away, so I'm just going to let it go. I'm going to let you do it because we both
Right.
I just wanted to ask about like the writing process for both of these books, because I know you both do work in the literary world, writing other things, not writing books. So how was it to sort of carve out this space for these books?
So like I really started my book like during the pandemic and I wrote it during like quarantine. And so like no one was going anywhere. Like we were like still washing blueberries at this point, you know, because like we didn't know like if you could bring a blueberry into the house safely. And so for me, like, you know, the world was just so shut down, and like it was also just a way to just black out from the fear into it. And so I was able to do it that way. And you know, I think one of the things that like writers famously say is like if you have writer's block is because you're not reading enough. And like I never have that problem because like I'm a literary agent and just like all my friends are writers, and so like we're always just like reading something. And so just like just by being in constant conversation, I find that it like, you know, I'm always, whatever I'm thinking about, like just always kind of like leads me back to the page somehow.
What is can I just get a little refresher on the
Wait, how do we carve it out? Did I answer
how
the
do we
question now?
carve it out? Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay.
For me, like I feel like my life exists in these like cycles where I'm like sort of obsessed with a story and then it ends, and then after it ends, I feel like really bereft and like don't know where the meaning is going to come from my life, and then like I search for another story, and then I work on it, and then it ends, and it's the same process. So part of wanting to write a book was like wanting to have a longer project and sort of not feeling like I was on this like boat that kept sinking. And I really liked it. I liked feeling like there was something I was like still going back to, and that like the pieces were fitting into something larger. I think like the hardest part for me is that I thought that by writing like different stories in the chapters, that in a way I was like carving out an easier task for myself. And I think then like the biggest problem became like, how do I make it so that the chapters are sort of building into a larger whole? And if I were to write another book, I would not do it this way. But I think it was like, I had never had the experience of like giving my book to friends to read. And I felt like I was constantly asking them like, what is this about? And then they like tell me what it was about. And like, they would like have like a couple good sentences and I would like integrate them in. And like, there was this weird sort of dynamic of people telling me what my book was about until at the very end I felt like I knew, but it really only came from other people like telling me what was on the page.
Makes your title so perfect.
I actually think the title is it is like not quite what the book is about, but that felt fitting also.
Rich, I was wondering if you could say more about identity and diagnoses and the way in which today, with diagnostic statistical manual being the basis of whether or not somebody is able to make use of their insurance to
Right.
get therapy,
Yeah.
that those identities, how they stick, and what you would say about how that informs one's life or how
Yeah.
you cast it off if indeed you are.
Yeah, I don't think you cast it off because I think like diagnoses serve such a like important practical purpose. Like you need them so people can communicate about, there's just like, they're a reality and you need them. But I think that like what's not often, people don't pay as much attention to the fact that like, I think there's this idea that like the diagnosis describes reality or describes a condition that is like fixed. And I don't think it's as if like a diagnosis is neutral. But I was interested in the way that like diagnoses sort of act on your sense of yourself and your sense of your future and your potential. And so there's this real like interactive process between like your identity and the sort of the way that your identity or your condition has been classified. And sometimes then you kind of adjust based on that, like the name that you've been given for what's going on. And I think that like interactive process was something that like I wanted to articulate, and like that I don't, this sort of this gap between like whatever your like pure experience is and then the words that are being used by experts to describe that experience.
Have you had any response from the psychiatric community?
I've definitely gotten more like enthusiasm from psychologists and social workers. I feel like I haven't gotten many, like, the response that I get is usually just people emailing after they read it. And like, I don't know, I think it's mostly been like psychoanalysts, social workers, psychologists. I don't know if psychiatrists just are not interested, but I have not heard that much from them.
I sent it to several psychiatrists and no response. The other question I have is this identity also apparent like in physical diagnosis?
I think it can be. I mean, I think like chronic illnesses are an interesting, where there's a sort of mental illness is more, I think it's more complicated because like the thing that is the mental illness often involves like feeling very suggestible or sort of porous or uncertain of your sense of self, and that doesn't necessarily like go with the territory of a physical illness. But I think there are doctors who think that like we haven't paid enough attention to, like illness careers and sort of the way that like, especially like disability, when people like, when the main form of welfare is disability, checks every month, and then you have to prove your disability, there's almost like an incentive to not work and to sort of identify as a disabled person, and I think that becomes a kind of loop too.
I'll I'll just add, if this is something you're interested in, there's a great podcast called The Death Panel, where they talk about essentially the capitalist market of health. And they recently had the most recent episode. They're talking about this issue of diagnoses and how health communism, right? It's so good.
These are
The yeah,
podcast hosts.
yeah. What are their names again?
Beatrice Adler Bolton and Artie Beard.
Yes, and that book is amazing.
Clams.
It's from Verso Books, and one of the things they're talking about on the podcast is that diagnoses are it's a form of communication, and it's a lot of times the only way that you can get care. And they're talking about it through long COVID, and that long COVID it's talked about diagnoses and disabilities, we talk about it through the parameters of productivity and work, and that if you don't have a diagnosis long COVID, you're just tired, and can cause all those issues. But it's a really good podcast, so I suggest it.
What's the name again?
Death Panel.
Panel?
Death Panel. Yeah.
I have a second question, sorry. I loved your book, Hafizah.
Thank you.
And I was really amazed by the scope of it and also the length and just how much space you took up with it. And I was wondering what that was like for you. Were you ever pressured to make it shorter, or did you have to sort of argue for the length? How did you come to the decision to make it that amount?
Yeah, I don't think I was never told to make it shorter because, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'd do. I'd be like, you do it, But I think that the length came organically. I think it's about 80 something. I don't know. But a lot of the issues I'm trying to connect. I'm trying to go in some chapters from point A to point 3.0. It's not even the alphabet. And so it's really, but we do that all the time, in our own lives. And so I think the topic really determined the space, but also as a poet who is less interested in the conventions and rules. There's a chapter I think that that's just all prose blocks, and so I was conscious of where the reader needed a break from information, and which is also part of the reason the images are in there. And so I tried to follow the pacing of the reader, but also I think one of the things I learned from the poet Jean Valentine is just what the reader can do in a leap, and just that's what a line break is in poetry. Is essentially it's the gap that you're trusting the reader to cross if you do the right work. And and I think that is trusting that gap. And I think it's kind of a different way of saying what Rachel's saying about when the reader needs context, because they can make those leaps. And so I think that really kind of got to how I wanted to, in terms of the length. Then it was each of the chapters are organized by theme, and so the opening chapter is about bodies and disability, and so I knew that there are certain aspects of of identity that I needed to cover, and that certain aspects of personhood that I wanted to cover, and I really wanted to make sure that those two race and personhood were two different buckets. If that helps. What did I say?
And what it was like to
Yeah.
pair together. Because I don't have that much information about why the two readings were paired together and what that was. Yeah.
Well, I noticed you laughing, and that was so helpful to me. No, for me, it's purely information needs to be visual for me, and so I can't I find podcasts very hard. I find readings very hard, and so I just assume that all of you are also just put it on a page and I'll read it quicker. Why are you reading out loud?
I read Rachel's book and I love it, so it was easy. And I work with her agent, and I literally while she was writing the book, I listened to PJ being I just read this, and so I was primed for it. Thank you.
I was so touched by the component of your story about the perfume bottle. And I'm an archaeologist, so I'm very interested in objects as vessels of memory. And that seemed like such a component of what you wrote. But I was also just curious about why you chose to keep that item from your mother. Because in describing it, you seemed kind of troubled by her reasoning for the purchase. So I wondered if you could explain.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like, it's like one of those outlier items of like your parents. Like, like whenever you're a kid and your parents like go out of the house and you search through everything, like, and you're just like, who are these people? And like after she died, like you find the usual things, but then there was this bottle and I don't remember my mother having a scent like that. Like she smelled like home, but like food. And it was just like, where was she going that she's buying this perfume? And like we did not splurge. Like she did not spend like money like that. And so there's just something about it. There's so much of that like inner life. And just the fact that like literally it still smells like it's completely empty, but it still smells like Jeter perfume, and of just like this like it's a moment in which like that like she wanted to feel special, which is like as an adult with like kids, like that's a moment your kids really aren't a part of, right? And so it's just like kind of represented this extreme personhood of like questions that like I'll never be able to like answer, and like because the answers are too diffuse, like it's not like I can be like, Dad, why'd you have this? Like he's not gonna know, like and so just that like it's kind of like embodies like the mystery of a person that you can hold, and I think a sense of permanency that like nothing should be left in that, but yet it still lingers.
I work for a federal public defense attorney, which is context for something that I really struggle with in that world. Pretty much everything, but one thing that I struggle with a lot is how reductive it is of people's humanness and wholeness, etc. And I haven't finished either of your books, but from the readings, it very much seems like you do a beautiful job of depicting people in their wholeness. And one thing that I like about the one little way in that we have for that is through the mitigation work of like getting to try to present someone as more than the thing that they're being, accused of. And so and I'm not a writer. That's not how I identify. And so I'm wondering if you have any like tips or tools or how you engage with that in your work, and in terms of how you try to depict people in their wholeness as much as is possible, especially when working with identities, the DSM, whatever it is that is trying to flatten someone's being.
I think like I've had fantasies about working as a mitigation specialist. Like it just seems like such an amazing job to like
First time you heard that.
to sort of to like have, because your job is to like write a biography of someone that makes them compelling and sympathetic, and I guess that does feel similar to the kind of thing, like I do make I think one way that I make someone feel more whole is to include their own words, but also to include like their friends and their family, and sort of have all these circles of like who they interact with. And, I'll probably have like an hour-long conversation with a friend, and it's like one little detail that feels revealing, that I might put in because it suddenly like makes that person feel more real. And I guess like just concrete details feel like it becomes not whole when it feels like you're sort of using like shorthand or stereotypes, but when it's like grounded in these like very specific details, then that person becomes like more of an individual. But yeah, I think like with the book especially, I first had thought of it more as like a case study form, and then I was like, no, like I need to include the voices of the family members who like see it from a different perspective. But like I thought that the different perspectives like made them feel more like full and complex.
Yeah, I think it's like it can really depend on who you're talking about, because in the book, like, you know, I write about my family, or I'm essentially like writing about like strangers. And with like family, you know, a lot of people are like, "I'll live to fight you." Like, so there's that, right? And so like, you know, just trying to figure out like, okay, like how do I be fair with like talking about like my family, but there are also some things that are not mine to tell, and like and just like really kind of understanding like that line. But in terms of like writing about like other people, so like the first chapter opens up at the Grand Canyon. We, like Camille and her husband and my wife, we all took a trip to the Grand Canyon right as the world was like shutting down and had to turn around. But what I'm writing about, also the Hafizah tribe that they live at the base of the Grand Canyon, and it wasn't something that like I was really paying attention to while we were there, right? Like I knew that like there was a tribe down there and that there was a school down there, but it was only like much later when we got back that I was like Googling the Grand Canyon and saw that there was this historic case that was happening at the time where the school was suing the federal government to get the students with disabilities having like their disabilities like classified as complex trauma, like having complex trauma classified as a disability. That way they could get like funding. And so I just started looking at that and I'm just like, okay. And so then it just because my book is like is really concerned with the idea of origins and beginnings, and it's always a question of like, where do you begin, you know? And I think for me, in terms of like writing about strangers or people, groups I don't know, it's like doing twice as much research than I think that I need, like finding research that is written by the communities. Like I contacted the tribe, I contacted like the Native American Disability Law Center. I talked to as many people as I could, but I also, because of like the chaos of the pandemic, I knew that like we don't always have the ability to be like, oh, I'm gonna like find you to make sure I'm and like talk to you, then tell your story, you know. But we also do have to write about the world. And so I try to take that responsibility really seriously in terms of like, because I know as like a Black queer woman how he was like, I've seen a movie, I know what Black people are like, you know. It's so easy to be reduced until you're nothing, right? And so like how to bring in like the full complexities, and you know, as people, like we're always like, we're very eager to see how we're alike, and like that can be great, but it can also be like tricky when you're talking about like people who have differences that are important to understand. And so try not to be either like duped by our similarities or our differences, and just really trying to, I don't know, it's hard, just like really trying to like understand what is there from the firsthand accounts versus like the stories we inherit through like, you know, a country, which is like all countries are just propaganda, you know? And so trying to separate that out, and just like having a ton of people read it after and just being like, yes, no, because it's hard to understand like where you make missteps. Yeah.
I think that's it. Thank you both. Thank you all.
Thank you.